Hi everybody. Before we move into the main respiratory lectures, I wanted to do this overview where you can find out the main points you need to know and also why we need to know them. So the respiratory system starts at the nose and moves down a tube which ends up branching into those two organs that we know of as the lungs. Within the lungs it continues to branch, it gets smaller and smaller but more numerous until eventually it's only a single epithelium thick. Now the respiratory system is a continuous system, but it does contain two major parts. The first is the conducting region. The conducting region starts at the nose and goes down the tube and enters into the lungs. The respiratory region is the area whereby we have those very small sacs at the bottoms of our lungs, and we need to get the oxygen from those sacs and into the bloodstream. By the way, you're expected to know both regions intimately. So what are we going to be learning? You're going to be learning lots of new terminology. You're also going to be taking a look again at the tissues, the epithelial tissues. So think back to that module and think about how the different functions of those different epithelial tissues go. We're also going to have a look at the mechanics of breathing. We're going to take a look at the muscles that are involved with breathing, and we're going to have a look at the physics of oxygen and carbon dioxide. What you'll note is that when we start looking down at gas exchange, we're looking at the respiratory region and also the cardiovascular region. The last thing that we'll be looking at in the main lectures is the neuronal control of breathing, and it's the autonomic system of the CNS. So as I said, lots of new terminology and again looking at tissues. And as we go through this module, you will start to remember old friends from previous modules. So first of all, we might have the elastic cartilage that you know is going to occur in the epiglottis. There's the hyaline cartilage, which is going to surround the airways, making sure that those tubes don't collapse on themselves. We also are going to have stratified squamous epithelium. Now you might remember that stratified means many layers, and you'll also remember that it's found in areas where we need protection. Why would the respiratory system need protection? Because in some parts it's joined with the digestive system. Here I'm talking about the mouth and the pharynx, and in this part the respiratory system needs to be protected against abrasion from food. You'll see that we have ciliated epithelium and goblet cells which produce mucus, and goblet cells are often found along with columnar epithelial cells. There's the simple squamous cells, or simple squamous epithelium, which, as we know, is involved in diffusion. So that's going to be down in those very small air sacs where we need to get oxygen into the bloodstream. And last, we have our smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is going to surround some of the very small tubes. We don't want cartilage down there. It'll interfere with diffusion. And the smooth muscles are able to allow these airways to become bigger, to dilate, and to become smaller in contraction. Pathology of the smooth muscle means, of course, we can have things like asthma. Then we will start to look at the mechanics of breathing, and we'll start first of all looking at muscles. Now what I want you to do is take a breath, a deep one. When you take a breath, you can feel the air moving in through the nose, and it's very easy to think that this is the start of breathing. However, it's not. Breathing actually begins at that muscle that's found between the division of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. You'll remember it being the diaphragm. The diaphragm, along with some other muscles that sit within between the ribs, called the intercostal muscles, will contract. When they contract, the thoracic cavity expands and the lungs will expand with them. Then we're going to have a look at the physics of getting oxygen into the blood. And it should be easy because it's simple diffusion, but it's simple diffusion with a problem. Oxygen actually isn't soluble in aqueous solutions, and plasma is nothing but a lot of water. So therefore oxygen has to have some kind of transport, and it has that in a protein called hemoglobin. So the ability of oxygen to bind to hemoglobin can vary somewhat. We call that ability of binding affinity. The affinity will vary depending on the concentration of oxygen, the concentration of carbon dioxide, the body temperature of the body, and the blood pH. And it's really important that it can be varied. The reason for that is if oxygen had a single affinity for hemoglobin, when it bound to hemoglobin, it would never release. That means that the tissues are never going to get the oxygen that they require. So I also said that it's going to be dependent somewhat on temperature, which seems a little bit strange until we think about the fact that what makes our body temperature, and it's when our muscles are working. When our muscles are working, they create heat as a byproduct. When our muscles are working is also when they really need that oxygen. So it's not surprising that when you have an increase in temperature, the hemoglobin is going to release the oxygen into the tissues. So that is half of the equation. Now we've looked at oxygen, we need to look at carbon dioxide. Now you may remember that we have an energy transporter, and it's called ATP. Now when the body and the mitochondria make this ATP, it consumes oxygen and it produces carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is a waste product and it's also toxic in very high concentrations, so we need to get rid of it. Now carbon dioxide is soluble in blood, so you might think, well, no problem. Of course, there's always going to be some kind of exception. With carbon dioxide, when it enters into aqueous solutions, it turns those solutions acidic. And you'll notice this when we do our workshops later on. So we can't have acidic blood. Therefore, the carbon dioxide has to be managed, and it gets turned into bicarbonate ions. Once in bicarbonate ions, it actually acts as a kind of buffer within the blood, protecting against pH changes, and it can now be easily transported to the lungs. The last thing that we're going to have a look at is the neuronal control of the respiratory system. So it is the central nervous system. We're looking at the hypothalamus and the pons and medulla oblongata of the brainstem. However, we need to have some kind of mechanism to notice change. What if we need to breathe more deeply? What if we need to breathe faster? There needs to be a way that there is input sent to the brain. And you'll remember that we have that form in the terms of afferent sensory nerve fibres. Remember, afferent, incoming, sensory means that we are getting information from some kind of receptors in the environment. The environment in this case being the outer body and the lungs themselves. So one of the receptors that we can look at are mechanoreceptors. Those mechanoreceptors measure stretch. So as we breathe in, our lungs expand, and the mechanoreceptors recognise whether or not the lungs have expanded enough or too much. But more importantly are the chemoreceptors. There are a couple of pairs of chemoreceptors, one of them found in the aorta coming out of the heart, and the others are the carotid bodies up in the neck. Now they are measuring oxygenated blood, but they're not looking for oxygen, they're looking for carbon dioxide. If the body recognises that there is too much carbon dioxide, then it tells the body we need to take a breath. So that's the end of this particular overview. I'm hoping that it was helpful to you, and we will see you soon.